There's a moment that every narcissist dreads more than almost anything else, and it doesn't come from you fighting back, arguing louder, or trying to win. It comes from something much quieter and much more devastating to them, the moment you simply stop being afraid, not performatively brave, not putting on a show of confidence to provoke a reaction, just genuinely, internally, no longer operating from fear in their presence. And the moment that shift becomes visible to them, something changes in the entire dynamic, something they were never actually prepared for because their whole system was built to manage a person who could still be frightened, not one who's simply stopped playing that role altogether. Today, we're breaking down 5 specific ways a narcissist reacts when this exact shift happens. Because recognizing these reactions is going to tell you everything about how deeply your fearlessness has actually threatened them. Here's what almost nobody explains clearly about fear in relationships with narcissists, and it matters enormously for understanding everything we're about to walk through. Fear was never just an unfortunate side effect of being close to someone difficult. It was, in a very real sense, the operating currency of the entire relationship, the thing that kept you compliant, kept you second-guessing yourself, kept you working overtime to avoid whatever consequence you'd learned to associate with disappointing them. When that fear disappears, and I mean genuinely disappears, not suppressed, not white-knuckled through, but actually resolved at a deep enough level that their usual tactics simply don't land the way they used to, the entire economy the relationship was built on collapses overnight. And a system that's lost its primary currency doesn't just adjust calmly. It reacts, often in very specific, very predictable ways. So let's walk through these 5 reactions, because once you understand each one, you'll be able to recognize exactly where a narcissist is in their own internal scramble. The moment they realize the fear that used to control you simply isn't there anymore. The first reaction is escalated intensity, an attempt to simply turn up the volume on whatever used to work, assuming that if the usual dose of intimidation, guilt, or anger isn't landing, a stronger dose surely will. This is often the very first response, because it requires the least amount of actual adjustment on their part. Rather than questioning whether the entire strategy has stopped working, they assume the strategy simply needs to be applied more forcefully. You might notice louder confrontations, more dramatic accusations, more intense emotional pressure than you're used to, all deployed with a kind of urgency that reveals more about their own growing alarm than about anything you've actually done. This escalation isn't a sign that your fearlessness failed to protect you. It's actually one of the clearest signs that it's working exactly as it should, because a tactic that was already effective wouldn't need this kind of desperate amplification to try to produce the same old result. The second reaction is confusion disguised as concern, where suddenly they're expressing worry about you, framed in language that sounds caring on the surface, but is actually designed to make your newfound calm seem like a problem that needs fixing. This might sound like "you've become so cold lately," or "I'm worried you're shutting down emotionally," or "this isn't like you, are you okay?" Notice what's actually happening underneath this concern. They're not genuinely worried about your well-being. They're disoriented by a version of you that no longer responds the way the old version did, and rather than sitting with that disorientation honestly, they're reframing it as something wrong with you, hoping that framing might convince you to doubt your own stability enough to abandon it and return to the more familiar, more manageable, more frightened version of yourself they know how to work with. The third reaction is attempted reversion through nostalgia, where they start referencing the earlier version of the relationship, the honeymoon phase, the moments of genuine connection you shared before things became difficult, trying to pull you back into an emotional state associated with a time when fear hadn't yet fully taken hold. This tactic works by exploiting the genuine, real feelings you had during that earlier period, using them as an emotional doorway back into old patterns. What's crucial to recognize here is that this nostalgia isn't really about rebuilding what was good. It's an attempt to access the emotional openness that made you vulnerable to fear in the first place, because that early trust and connection was always the entry point through which fear eventually took hold. The fourth reaction is testing through smaller, more calculated provocations, almost like probing for a weak spot rather than launching a full assault. This is where you might notice smaller comments, subtle boundary tests, minor jabs delivered almost casually, watching closely for any sign that the old fear response might still be accessible somewhere underneath the calm. This testing phase can be one of the most important to recognize because your consistent, unshaken response to these smaller probes is often what finally convinces them that the shift is real and lasting, rather than a temporary phase that might crack under smaller, more sustained pressure. The fifth reaction, and this is the one that tends to be the most revealing of everything happening underneath, is withdrawal disguised as disinterest, where they suddenly seem to pull back entirely, acting as though your fearlessness simply isn't worth engaging with anymore. This withdrawal is rarely genuine indifference. It's much closer to retreat, an inability to find a functional angle in a dynamic where the usual tools no longer produce results, dressed up as though they're the ones choosing to disengage rather than being effectively locked out of the control they used to have. And underneath all five of these reactions, there's something crucial tying them together, something that explains exactly why fearlessness specifically, more than any confrontation or argument, represents such a fundamental threat to how a narcissist operates, and understanding that deeper mechanism is exactly where we're headed next. That's exactly where we're going next. That deeper mechanism, the reason fearlessness threatens a narcissist more fundamentally than any confrontation ever could, comes down to something we've touched on before, but that deserves full attention here. Fear was never just a tool they used on you. It was the primary evidence of their impact, the clearest, most reliable confirmation that they still held power over your internal state. When fear disappears completely, they're not just losing a tactic. They're losing the single most convincing proof they had that they still mattered, still had control, still existed as someone powerful enough to shape another person's emotional world. This is why escalated intensity, confused concern, nostalgic pulls, small provocative tests, and eventual withdrawal all trace back to the same root. Each one is an attempt to reestablish some form of emotional leverage, because without fear as the currency, they genuinely don't know how else to relate to you. Fear-based control isn't just one tool in their arsenal. For many narcissists, it's the primary architecture the entire relationship was built on, and losing access to it doesn't feel like losing a single tactic. It feels like losing the relationship's entire operating system all at once. Here's what's worth understanding about why fearlessness works this way when almost nothing else does. Arguing back, setting boundaries with visible frustration, even leaving in anger. All of these responses still involve emotional engagement that a narcissist can work with because emotional reactivity in any direction still confirms their impact. Genuine fearlessness is different because it removes reactivity itself. There's no anger to redirect, no hurt to exploit, no anxious energy to manipulate. What's left is simply calm, steady presence that doesn't require anything from them anymore. And that absence of need is precisely what a system built entirely around being needed cannot process or counteract. I want to address something important here, because becoming genuinely fearless isn't a switch you flip through willpower alone, and it's worth being honest about that. If you're in the middle of this shift right now, watching some of these 5 reactions play out and still feeling flickers of the old fear underneath your calm exterior, that's completely normal. Fearlessness that holds under real pressure is built gradually, through repeated evidence that you can survive their reactions without the catastrophic consequences your nervous system spent years anticipating. Each time you notice yourself staying steady through one of these 5 reactions, even imperfectly, even with your heart pounding underneath a calm face, you're adding to that evidence. The goal was never to feel nothing. It was to act from clarity even while the old fear occasionally still whispers underneath it. I also want to name something for anyone who is currently living through the more intense reactions on this list. The escalated intensity especially. If becoming fearless has coincided with your safety actually feeling more uncertain rather than less, that distinction matters enormously, and it's worth taking seriously rather than pushing through alone. Recognizing these patterns intellectually is valuable, but if escalation is moving into territory that feels genuinely unsafe, that's a signal to bring in outside support, a therapist, a domestic violence resource, trusted people who can help you navigate the practical realities of the situation, not just the psychological ones. So, what does it actually mean once you can recognize all five of these reactions clearly, watching them unfold in real time? I think it means something worth sitting with fully. Every single one of these reactions, however uncomfortable to witness, is confirmation that something in you has genuinely shifted, deeply enough that the person who once knew exactly how to move you no longer does. That shift didn't happen by accident, and it isn't fragile just because it's new. It's the direct result of choosing, again and again, to stay steady instead of collapsing back into old patterns. And every reaction you're witnessing right now is simply proof of exactly how much that steadiness has already changed the entire shape of what used to control you. If this helped you recognize what you've been living through, or gave you language for a shift you're still in the middle of, know that you're far from the only one navigating this exact process. And there's a lot more we can work through together as we go. Make sure you're subscribed because we go deeper into this every single week.